Hello, good morning again. Welcome to part 2 of our conversation. So, Dr. Perkins, this component of the conversation is going to get really interesting. Your book chronicles psychological data on personality and genes. It is not an evolutionary anthropology book. You're not an ecologist. What's your degree in? Is your degree in psychology
No, I've got a degree in biology
or in
from
biology?
Cardiff University.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
And what's your
Um,
PhD in?
so my PhD is in the biological basis of anxiety proneness.
I
So
don't know why I
explaining
thought
why.
you're a psychologist. Maybe it's because of your research.
No, please don't insult me like
Okay,
that.
because you write on psychological issues with a biological component. So I don't know why I thought
Yeah, yeah.
you
So
were a psychologist.
so no, the thing is, as one philosopher once said, all truth is connected, whereas each lie stands alone. So biology and psychology, when you drill down into them, are touching the same truth. So
And
I
you,
was
you,
interested
you
in
are
the.
never described as a biologist by the media.
My job description was literally the neurobiology of personality, a lecturer.
Yes.
So it was there. It's literally on the book cover.
Yeah.
Um, but no, I don't have a psychology degree as such. I'm a biologist with an interest in the biological basis of personality.
Even better, even better. So because you are a scientist, I'm sure you will have the latitude to discuss life history strategy because you mentioned RK selection in your book. And I read carefully. I'm quite meticulous when reading data. So when I was reading your book, I looked at the footnotes. In one of your later chapters, there is this fascinating study on welfare in Europe. And you argued that the findings of this study counter the thesis of the welfare trait. And I read it and I agree with your conclusion. But this is where the conversation gets spicy. So politically, I'm a libertarian. And I think that I'm to the right of most people, even hereditarian scientists. When it comes to scientific research and heritability, I'm really to the right of the spectrum. And I've written before that welfare has a less deleterious effect in some societies. So in Scandinavia, people are individualistic. So Scandinavians are not as individualistic as the British and the Americans, but they're individualistic and they're autonomous. They could be the most autonomous people in the world. So based on the world value surveys and other studies, Scandinavians are autonomous and individualistic. And one writer mentioned that Scandinavians are the most individualistic people in the world, but I think that that argument is still debatable. You argued that the sample size was a European sample size, and in those European countries, the welfare effect was not as pronounced elsewhere. Then the piece concluded by saying that in such society, and I'm paraphrasing, in autonomous societies with a strong work ethic, welfare might not have a super negative impact. And I agree. Because if you live in a society like like Scandinavia, where people value autonomy, punctuality, and acquiring human capital, even if welfare erodes social norms to an extent, like what Lindbeck said, it is not going to disseminate the society. That's something that I have
Yeah,
discovered over time. So the
no,
effects of
that
welfare vary based on the quality of the population.
yeah, totally. So for example, have you read James Bartholomew's book, The Welfare of Nations?
No, I
So
didn't
he
read his
what he
book.
does, that's if anyone's interested in comparisons between international welfare states, I recommend James's book. Big plug, James. Um, because, for example, he looks at Japanese uptake of disability benefit. Okay, because in the UK, disability benefit is extremely common. There's something like 20-25% of the population are classed as unable to work because of disability. Um, it varies depending on which governments tend to relabel these things to try and cook the books. But in the take-home message is in the UK, we've got a weirdly disabled population. Uniquely highly disabled. But what he then did is he contrasted to Japan, where the uptake of welfare and disability benefits is much lower. It's somewhere around 1 or 2%. So that's a good point, which really feeds into your statement, that the population in question does matter. So in Japan, where people have a culture of um, being dutiful and honorable, their cultural norms prevent them from exploiting the disability system. Okay, whereas in other countries which are less have a different cultural background, there's much higher levels of disability uptake, um, such as the UK. Now, Sweden is a good point. Um, Sweden's a great country to look at because historically they've had a high work ethic, you
Yes.
know,
James is at
but
the IEA. I'm wondering who I didn't see his book. The IEA does really good work on Sweden.
yeah, James is yeah, he's a well-known journalist and a wonderful writer. So I highly recommend his book on welfare states. I mean, he doesn't just look at welfare; he also looks at the health services and things. So it's a really interesting book for broader understanding. But Sweden is interesting because if you look, Sweden has had extremely high levels of immigration from refugees and asylum seekers, who are now overrepresented amongst the unemployed. The same in Germany, the same
And the
in
Netherlands.
and the Netherlands.
There's a
There was a
famous new study
new
published
study
by
just come out, a
academics in the
huge,
Netherlands.
exactly, a huge new study coming out showing that there's a really huge differences in economic contributions of different immigrants. Like Western European immigrants to the Netherlands are equal, or if anything, even bigger contributors than native Dutch. Whereas the immigrants from third world countries, particularly Muslim countries, tend to be net recipients of government money.
Just
So,
like in the UK, just like in the
yeah,
UK, EEA
exactly.
immigrants are better than non-Western immigrants.
Exactly. So when it comes to immigration, you should be really choosy about who you let into your country. So, for example, if the UK imported 10 million Japanese people, for example, the UK would probably become more functional because it would raise the average level of conscientiousness if we had
Yes.
10 million Japanese people being very neat
And
and polite.
Adam, because this is part two, the I'm in this episode, I'm going to be really chatty, but I follow the research on genetics daily. And there's a relatively new study, it was published when maybe last year, the year before, by David U. Jones, and that study explored the genetic decline of the UK of the UK's population. So the authors pointed out that there has been a selection for negative traits in the UK population.
Mm, yeah, yeah, that's common across a wide range
Western
of nations.
society, yes.
It's been found that genetic variants for educational attainment are negatively selected against. So if you have a system where smarter people delay reproduction because they're going to do university degrees or PhDs and so forth, then the genetic variants they carry that code for educational attainment, which is a sort of proxy for IQ, those genetic variants get out competed by the uh, other genetic variants for lower educational attainment, in the people who are busy making babies rather than studying. So what we're seeing is idiocracy is becoming true.
Yes.
Have you seen that movie by Mike
No, I
Judge called
didn't watch the
Idiocracy?
movie, but
You
I
got to
read
watch it. You would love it.
Edward Dutons and Michael Woodley of Minis Book, and I know you were interviewed by Edward Dutton.
Yeah, that's right. Edward did a podcast with me a little while ago, and so yeah, I highly recommend all your viewers go and watch Idiocracy, the movie by Mike Judge, because it's a sort of a satirical, jokey movie about how if you encourage reproduction in the least able people, it just causes society to break down, and now we're actually seeing it come true.
Yeah, Vollmark Weiss is German, so it could be Weiss and not Weiss, but Vollmark Weiss also excoriates the welfare state on the same basis. So Vollmark is this distinguished academic from Germany, and he makes similar points that welfare is dysgenic.
Mm. Yeah, and he said, well, it's not just welfare. I mean, education is dysgenic, right? It's a fertility shredder. If you have a system which cherry picks the brightest people and then basically artificially limits the number of children they have compared to 500 years ago, you could. There's lots of things that are dysgenic, and they all kind of combine together into this big disaster.
But I find it quite odd that in the UK, when you apply to study as a foreign student, you are able to import dependent relatives or lovers. Right? That's what I'm going. That's a term that I'm going to use. Your dependents. You could
Yeah,
import a relative or a lover because some people
yeah,
bring spouses, other people bring relatives. I
yeah.
think that's a stupid idea. If you're going to study in the study and get your degree, why are you
Yeah.
importing
It's
externalities?
it's again, it's part of the same absolutely crazy sort of cultural shift where open borders are regarded as the good vibes. Hey man, let's all just be peaceful and loving and have open borders, and allowing people to bring their grandparents when they're doing a bachelor's degree is just insane. Like you
Yeah,
say.
and some groups are more likely to bring relatives than others. So Africans, they have a propensity for bringing relatives. Like I met some Africans and one brought a spouse. Some groups are like that. So in my article for Aporia on immigration, I cited Matt Godwin because there's a research article, but I couldn't locate the substance of it online, but Matt had good data. So 50% of immigrants, nearly 50% of immigrants from countries like Ghana and Jamaica are living in social housing in London. And that's not surprising. The Bayesian immigrants do really well. So in Canada, they are successful when compared to other blacks. They're richer and their poverty rate is lower. It could be the lowest of all black groups in Canada. But Jamaicans are more likely to be in prison. They're more criminal. And when you compare them to native men in countries like the UK and America, where men are not as impressive. So not all immigrants are equally productive. Therefore, when policymakers are recruiting immigrants, they ought to be more selective. And I'm not from Europe. Obviously, I'm black. I am not from Europe. But positive immigration is really about European human capital. And these studies are being churned out frequently. The last study was published by the Journal of Political Economy, and this study is documenting autonomy and the relationship between autonomy and other favorable economic outcomes. And Sweden was used as a proxy for autonomy. So distance from Sweden correlated levels of autonomy. So positive immigration is really about Europeans, East Asians, and upper class Indians.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. There's no such thing as magic dirt. Magic dirt is just a myth. It's all about the people, the particular people. I mean, look at Switzerland, right? Switzerland. Have you ever been to Switzerland?
No, I've never been to Switzerland, but I would love to
So,
go.
Yeah, so Switzerland's a fantastic country. I've been lucky enough to visit a couple of times, and it's basically just rocks. It's kind of rocks and trees and some water, and yet from those kind of tough, pretty much challenging environmental situations, the Swiss have managed to create pretty much the richest country in the world per capita, pretty close to it. So that's to do with the people. It's the people of Switzerland that have created this through hard work and intelligence. And we can't just fantasize that if we randomly took people from other parts of the world and we parachuted them into Switzerland, they would do the same because they wouldn't.
No, no, people really need to get serious about culture, biology, intelligence, and also non-cognitive traits. So I'm becoming a bit bored by research on the genetics of IQ. It's still, in a sense, this type of research is still in its infancy because we have yet to identify a specific gene that you can say, okay, this particular gene is responsible for 95% of your intelligence. I have seen there's a study in molecular psychiatry that found a particular gene that affects intelligence, but
Yes,
we're
yeah.
yet to isolate the effects of specific genes. But I
Well,
would love to see more research on the genetic components of non-cognitive traits because they're also important. And some groups
yeah.
who are lower.
Yeah, so the way it works is there is no one gene for IQ. So there's many thousands of genetic variants that each contribute a tiny amount to your intelligence. Um, and and so what we are finding is that those many thousands of variants are beginning to be discovered. But there's so many of them, and they each contribute such a tiny amount. You need enormous samples to
Yes.
find them, but they are out there because previously the classic left-wing argument against the heritability of IQ was that, oh well, you can show that monozygotic twins are more similar on IQ than dizygotic twins, but you can't find the genes for IQ. So checkmate, bigot. But now, actually, because of the advent of large-scale GWAS,
Yes.
genome-wide association studies, they are starting to discover the genetic variants that relate to IQ,
Yes.
and likewise personality. The big problem is to find these genetic variants, you need really big samples who've been measured on IQ, for example, and not many big samples have gigantic numbers of scores for IQ. The best they can hope for is educational attainment. So so many of these really big genetic cohorts, genetically sampled cohorts, they just have like what's your maximum education level? What did you graduate high school? Did you go to a bachelor's degree? So they're having to use these things as a very rough proxy. Likewise with personality, there's very few big genetically informed cohorts that have personality scores, because it takes a lot of organization. If you need to get genetic data from 5 million people, it takes a lot of uh, organization to administer personality tests to these people. Um, so although you would eventually get a result, these practical problems are big problems.
Yes. And welfare is also depleting human capital. That's the indirect argument against welfare explicated in your book because you argue that the welfare trait, it promotes aggression, low conscientiousness. Such people are more reproductive, and individuals with such traits don't have a strong appetite for human capital. I think that's on
Yeah.
page 140 something. I don't remember.
Well, on the very first page, I talk about human capital as a concept. You know, here we have the very first page. In October 1833, a young English biologist traveling in South America mused in his journal about the factors that influence the success of a nation, concluding, a republic cannot succeed until it contains a certain body of men imbued with the principles of justice and honor. That biologist was Charles Darwin. In
Yes.
his journal entry, he touched upon a resource that is now recognized as exerting a significant influence on the prosperity of a nation, namely human capital.
But you know, I'm laughing because what I'm about to say is super politically incorrect. How politically incorrect would you describe yourself?
I'm just a truth seeker.
You're just a truth
Like,
seeker, yeah. I don't like the term controversy either because I think
yeah,
it's lame. If you like blue and I like green, that's a controversy. And controversy is new and different, and there's nothing that's really new or
the
different.
main what you have to decode it, right? So when the media say controversial, what they mean is this person has come up with something that disproves the blank slate.
Yes,
That's
yes,
what they mean by controversial. Like, like if I said there's only two sexes, right? You know, the media talk about the controversy over the number of sexes, right? There's,
yes.
if I,
And you're so
so if,
smart. You're smart because you're using the word sex and not gender. Gender is a political construct. Therefore, if it is a political construct, it can operate on a social spectrum. Hence, there are multiple genders, but only two sexes. Anti-woke people who use the term gender are stupid. Just
yeah, yeah, I
eliminate it
agree.
completely.
I agree. But the point is, if I go public, if I go public and say there are only two sexes, because the media is controlled in this sort of left wing blank slate space, they will say controversial biologist
Yes,
Dr. Adam Perkins says there's only two sexes. But the point is, this is not controversial. Sex is determined by gamete size. Okay,
yes.
so if you have big gametes, you're a woman. If you have small gametes, you're a man. That's how it works. And
Yeah,
there's
I
no
got
there's no
I I
there's no
got
in between.
Google I got Google Gemini AI to admit that its research on sex differences is flawed. So when our conversation concluded, Google said I should do more research because it admitted that a biological man is not a woman.
No, sex is binary and it's determined by
Yes.
gamete size. There is no in between gamete size. You don't have you don't have spurgs, do you? You have sperms or eggs.
Yes,
There's no in between, and it's not a matter of debate. This is not controversial,
it is
but
not.
because of the way that the media, the legacy media, not social media, but the legacy media is pushing the left wing agenda, they are saying controversial biologist says there's only two sexes. Amongst biologists, it's not controversial.
Yeah, like Telegraph the poll, most people poll said that sex is binary. The others who said no are clearly deluded. But we know sex is binary. Men,
Yeah.
women, end of story.
Gamete size is the determining factor. It's not genitals. People say, oh well, you know, you have people with intersex genitals and stuff, but these are edge cases. Like we said before, you cannot make decisions on edge cases, and they are not actually vice hermaphrodites in the sense that they don't produce intermediate gametes. Um, it's the gametes you produce that determine your sex.
Yeah. So this is my politically incorrect point because you mentioned human capital, and I'm a student of economic history. I actually studied history and IR formally. Europe, Western Europe. Blacks did not build Western Europe. They did not build England. They did not build America. The evidence does not endorse this thesis. And I've read people like Fieldos. I'm familiar with Grover Clark's research. I've comprehended the studies. I've edited them. I've basically consumed the big studies. And no, blacks did not
Mm.
build England. Human capital is important. It was really human capital that conferred an advantage on England rather than intelligence. The British had a stronger relationship in the private sector. Entrepreneurs and intellectuals communicated more in England. The apprenticeship program in England was superior. Workmen in England were skilled and efficient. In France, there was an elitist culture. So the educated people in France were not as commercial. The British were more adept at commercializing ideas and bringing products to market. East Asians have had a human capital advantage for a long time. In China, the elites were reproducing. So people in China on average were smarter, they were intelligent, there was a bureaucracy, but they were also conformist. And these elite people were reproducing conformist traits. So when the Chinese, of course, you're familiar with the story, when the Chinese were confronted with Jesuit science, they used it to confirm the preconceived notions. That did not spark a scientific revolution in China. So it was really human capital that gave Britain an edge rather than intelligence. They were better at commercializing ideas. It wasn't
Yeah,
slavery. It was
yeah,
not
yeah.
slavery.
I mean, there's a really good book. There's a really good book on this topic actually, which you may have read by Gregory Clark called
Yeah, I interviewed Gregory. Yeah.
yeah, Gregory's brilliant. So you know, he said there's a lot of things going on here. So one of them is the geographical position of Britain, in that we were a sort of quite small island off the shore of mainland Europe, and we were much harder to invade. So we had less disruption. So there's more of an incentive to invest long term. Imagine if you're a businessman in France, in medieval France, let's say, right? Or
Yes.
medieval Germany or medieval Poland. Imagine you are Lipton, the businessman in Poland in 1400, right? Um, do you really have much incentive to invest? Because tomorrow an army could just invade and destroy your factory, right? So you're going to be reluctant to invest in building a factory if it can just be swept away by an invading army, or in some cases a corrupt administration. Okay, whereas in the UK, according to Clark's theory, we had this isolation which protected us, so we didn't get invaded. We haven't actually been invaded successfully since 1066.
Yeah.
That's much less frequent. So there was a better incentive. It's more logical for British business people to invest long term in their factories and commercial enterprises. But plus, there's also the high trust society. So
Yes.
we had quite strong legal protections. So if imagine if you're a businessman in Russia now, right? Let's say you're Liptonsky, Mr.
Yes.
Liptonsky in Russia, right? So if you invested in a factory in Moscow or St. Petersburg, there's a risk that one day you'll come into work and you'll try to put your key in the door, but your key doesn't work anymore because the factory is now owned by the local mafia.
Yes.
You know, and it's all done legally. So the legal system in Russia is less transparent and less fair than in other countries. So if you add all this up together, you add up the geographical protection of the British Isles with the high trust society where your what you invest in remains yours. You keep a legal title to the factory that you built. Um, if you add all this together, you get a kind of virtuous circle where it kind of spirals up and it culminates in the 1700s and the 1800s with the Industrial
Yes.
Revolution.
It cultivated what Joel Mokyr dubs the idea of progress.
Mm, yeah,
So the
exactly.
British Europeans had an idea of progress. They wanted to discover new knowledge, to use this knowledge to solve real
Yeah,
problems. There wasn't an
yeah,
idea of progress in China. The Enlightenment
yeah.
movement in China was really conservative. So there's this movement that some people term a Chinese Enlightenment movement, but in reality, it was not.
No, no, and so that idea of progress was easier to carry out in the UK because of this high trust society, and that creates a chicken and egg scenario, right? So the UK became successful because it had a high trust society, but where did that high trust society come from?
Yes.
You know, Why did we become more conscientious? No one really knows.
Genes. I
Well,
think Gregory Clark has the best explanation.
it's a mystery because obviously the genes for being high trust were being selected for. Like every population contains some genetic variants for high trust. You
Yes,
know, you could go to some dysfunctional failed state and you can meet people who are good people,
yes,
who are trustworthy. But for some reason, over time in the UK, in Great Britain, those genetic variants for high trust, they were more successful. So they spread through the population. Whereas in a chaotic, dysfunctional society where you can't invest in anything because tomorrow somebody could take it away, those genetic variants were less successful. But no one knows where this comes from. It's a chicken and egg question. Um, I mean, very early on, in about 900 AD, there was already some signs of this. So this was before the Norman invasion,
yes.
not long after the Romans, not long after the fall of the Romans. There was already some signs of this kind of breaking away from the family and the clan, breaking away from that to the state or the community. So they introduced the thing called, blood money. Have you heard of blood money?
Yeah, yeah,
Where in Anglo-Saxon it was called weregild,
yeah.
right? So if you killed somebody, if Lipton got angry, you got into a fight, right? And you killed someone from another family in Anglo-Saxon England, your family would have to pay them money, blood money, compensation, and people don't like paying money. So that actually was an incentive to stop doing these kind of aggressive acts. Whereas in other cultures where it's all organized in family terms, um, you end up with a vendetta. So if you kill someone in another family, right, then their family members kill someone in your family, and you get this kind of um, you know Italian style vendetta where you tit for tat killings. Um, so somehow, even very early on, in about 900 AD, in the UK, there was already a kind of departure from the clan, the family-based justice, to the state justice. And this culminated in the Magna Carta. So the famous Magna Carta,
Yeah.
which was basically setting down that there is a rule of law. The law is not just what the king dreams up if the king gets out of bed this morning, the king decides I'm going to make this into the law. That's not the law. The Magna Carta specifies the law is external from the king.
Rule of law,
Um,
not rule by law. So even today, China is described as a rule by law state.
That's right, exactly. So even today, there's these countries which are highly advanced in many ways, but they still cannot break away from this sort of corrupt clan-like family-based society. Even in Greece, like one of our students is from Greece, and Greece is a wonderful country, highly the cradle of civilization in many ways. And yet she was saying, when it comes to things like a driving test in Greece, if you're a bad driver, you can pay a bribe to the examiner and he will pass you for the driving test, even though you're not supposed to be. Um, and likewise, if if you're not related to the driver and you don't pay him a bribe, he may fail you, even though you are a good driver. You know what I mean? So there's this
But
general problem.
Adam, people like to rehash the effects of colonialism, and that's one of my areas of research. I have seen studies painting Western colonialism in a positive light, but they are often criticized. However, the consensus is that Japanese colonialism was good. That's not a critical argument. But I've seen few studies exploring the implications of Ottoman colonialism on its former colonies. The studies I've seen so far, one was published in Comparative Studies Review. I think that's the name of the journal. And that study said that the Ottomans had a negative impact on some of their colonies. But The Greeks were under Ottoman rule. And as he said, the Greece is the cradle of Western civilization in many eras. So I'm wondering, could Ottoman rule explain some of these findings? Because the few studies that do exist depict Ottoman rule in a negative empirical light.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that's right. So you're looking at what they medieval people would call the Moors. So there was a Moorish invasion into Spain, um, and then part of Italy, part of Sicily,
Yeah.
and
And
generally
don't
speaking,
want to cut you, but the latest study on the Islamic conquest of Europe suggests that on average it was negative.
yeah, yeah. The old stereotype was again this kind of fuzzy, feel good left wing vibe. How hey, all this modern Western education just comes from Arabic
Not
scholars,
true.
and it's just not true. It doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Um, but yeah, you're right. So there's there's um, there's quite a possibility that the influx of Turkish or Moorish or Ottoman influence into countries like Greece um, did did somehow reduce their human capital by taking away less, reducing the European sort of content of their culture.
Yes.
Um, but even ancient Greece wasn't really some kind of dream ideal place. Like they did have democracy, but democracy didn't include a large part of the population. So they had the concept of voting um, for Greek politicians, but they were very constricting about who they allowed to vote.
But maybe that's one way to improve the quality of a democracy, even though Greek democracy was messy. Maybe in the modern society, people who vote should have at least have a high school education. They should work and they should not be on
No,
welfare.
no, no, no. I wouldn't agree.
You know,
The no, the benefit of voting. So the reason why parliamentary democracy or Western democracy works is because it uses the wisdom of the crowd. Do you know the scientific concept of the wisdom of the crowd?
yes.
Yeah. So basically, democracy represents the wisdom of the crowd. So the best example was the Brexit referendum, right? In the UK, we had the Brexit referendum when we decided that we didn't want to be governed by unelected Belgians. Like we got a parliament. We don't need Belgian people to tell us what to do. And that seems obvious, right? Like why would I mean, if imagine if you said to an Australian, right? Let's say you were interviewing an Australian, and you said to him or her, "Hey, how about you give up your lawmaking and give it to a parliament in Indonesia?" So Australia gets controlled by bureaucrats in Indonesia. If the Australian people would just look at you like you're insane, right? Um, or if you said to American, like you must have interviewed quite a lot of Americans, and if you said to them, "Hey, I've got an idea, guys. How about the American House of Congress and the Senate? That maybe those guys give up their lawmaking powers and you give them up to a parliament in Guatemala."
They would laugh at you, laugh at your
They would laugh at
scorn.
you. But this is what was inflicted on us. So that this kind of metro leftist cabal, Tony Blair and John Major, Gordon Brown, they actually disenfranchised the British people by giving away our democratic powers without our consent to Brussels.
Yes.
A
But
supranational government was
we're
ruling
running
over us.
out of time,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
So
So,
the
but
wisdom of the crowds was basically that. That was the people speaking up. So the reason it works is because the each of us has bias. Like I've got bias, you've got bias. But if you ask a million people a question of judgment, those biases cancel out. So you end up
yeah,
with an accurate
yeah, yeah.
judgment.
So, but thanks for coming on. Speaking to you has been a pleasure, and
Mhm.
I hope
Thank you very much, and
it's
please
enjoyed
keep
by
going
our
with it.
listeners.
Please,
What did
please
you
keep
say?
going with your writing. As keep
Okay.
going with your authorship. I've read your articles in Aporia magazine.
Oh, good. I have some more coming out. All right. Bye.